Probably our clearest examples are like acute stressors, whereby we know that can have a direct impact on cow physiology. For example, a stress that causes a cortisol spike in cows may lead to a block or reduction in, say, oxytocin release, which may actually limit milk you'll let down in cows.
Welcome to Rumination, the podcast that dives down deep in some of the issues and opportunities in the ruminant industry. Hi, I'm Chris Quinn, your host, and today I'm talking with Dr. Trevor Devries from the University of Guelph. Trevor is a professor and the Canada Research Chair in Dairy Cattle Behavior and Welfare. Dr. Devries has received numerous industry awards. Most recently, in 2021, the Nutrition Professionals Applied Dairy Nutrition Award from the American Dairy Science Association. And again in 2021, the Medicam Bovine Welfare Award from the Canadian Veterinary Association. So congratulations, Trevor, on those recent awards. Today we want to discuss and learn more about stressors in dairy cows and maybe expand a bit on how single and multiple stressors impact the cow's physiology, her behavior, and subsequently her health and performance, and how these stressors can be measured and how they can be alleviated. So with that in mind, Dr. Devries, thanks again for your time.
Thank you for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Trevor, you've been studying cows for, 15 years, and your work in dairy cow behavior continues to create a lot of clear understanding about what's going on, in particular during the transition cow and feeding behavior. Today, I wanted to talk more about stressors, and the industry often focuses a lot on heat stress, rightfully so. Yet, there are many other stressors that impact cows. And what are some of the common stressors that cows may interact with on a daily basis on a dairy?
Yeah, no, good question. And as you said, probably the one that gets the most attention is heat stress. Again, that's in some places of the world, that's 365 days a year. In other parts of the world, that's more temporal, right?
Yeah.
But there are other stressors, as you mentioned, that cows may face regardless of environmental conditions throughout the year. And probably the biggest one that we know of is social stress. Mm-hmm. And that social stress can come from a variety of different places. Now, we know cows are social animals and they like to be in social environments, but there are aspects of that social environment that may have negative effects on them and be actually stressful to those animals. For example, when we've got overcrowded situations, whether that's overcrowding at the feed bunk, at the lying stalls, or even, say, like a holding pen for a parlor. We know that can have negative impacts on those cows, be stressful to those cows, and then change their behavior, have physiological effects as well. There's other types of social stress that might be negative too, just parity composition of groups, right? When we mix young animals with older animals, that can have a negative impact, particularly on those younger animals. And similarly, and kind of related to that, would also be situations where we move animals or regroup them with new animals, particularly around stressful periods of time, like calving. Okay. And that, again, that may compound together and have negative effects. So that's kind of on the social side of things. There are other kind of stressors we can think of as well. Nutritional stressors, for example, that may not only be a stress on the cow physiologically, like the rumen, just that a change in diet, but then just from a perception standpoint, the cow may also view a big change in diet as a stressor as well, and may not adjust their eating behavior quickly enough to adapt to, say, that new diet. And so that could be a source of stress. And then another example would be just physiological events, like calving itself could be viewed as a stressor. And so there might be stress associated with that, and then other, say, health events that occur, right? So while stress can lead to health events in themselves, particularly those that may be painful to the animal, could be a source of stress. And so that could snowball and compound in those situations as well.
Thinking about things like lameness or metritis, I guess.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah. And so these stressors, and you mentioned altering physiology. So can you expand a bit on how these stressors do impact the cow's physiology?
Yeah, no, and that's it's an area where there's good research, but we still need more. Definitely, probably our clearest examples are like acute stressors, whereby we know that that can have a direct impact on cow physiology. For example, a stress that causes a cortisol spike in cows may lead to a block or reduction in, say, oxytocin release, which may actually limit, say, milk letdown in cows. And so probably one of the clearest examples of that is like bad handling of cows in a milking parlor. And there's some really cool research over the years to show that, right? If we don't handle cows well, or if they're mishandled, you'll see that spike in cortisol. You'll see lesser letdown of milk in response to a kind of a block of oxytocin release in those cows. And so those kind of there are clear evidence of that kind of acute stress. We also know that a lot of these stressors we talked about, those are more chronic type stressors. And chronic stress can have differential effects. We know that in itself, like if a cow has chronic stress, and a physiological response to that would be, say, cortisol or increased blood cortisol levels, that in itself can have negative impacts on, say, the immune system and even reproductive hormones, and so leading to reproductive problems in cows. The other thing that we know is that in kind of chronic long-term stress situations, elevated cortisol actually sometimes then gets responded to physiologically by the body by actually becoming less sensitive to that.
Okay.
And as a result of that, you see other things happening. And so some work over the last decade has demonstrated kind of a correlation between that and then the say, systemic inflammation that we see in cows in and around, say, for example, transition, and then the effects, kind of the trickle-down effects that we see in terms of health and productivity. And so there's some kind of really neat studies where they've demonstrated that, cows that develop disease and reproductive problems, when we look back on those cows, we not only see negative energy balance, we see inflammation, but then also markers of stress in those cows as well. And so they all seem to be tied together. Probably the other aspect or thing that can happen is a change in behavior of cows too. And mentioned that before, stress in itself could change the behavior of cows, which then leads to negative physiological effects. And just an example of that would be different types of stressors change, say, the activity of cows, even rumination behavior of cows. We see that with heat stress, and we see that with other types of even acute stressors where there's a systemic effect of the stress on the behavior of the cow, whereby they'll actually say, for example, stop ruminating, which then leads to the cow not eating as much because the rumen slows down, passage rate slows down, and then obviously a reduction in intake has a trickle-down effect on energy balance of the cow, production, etc. So, and health. And so you have this, again, this kind of compounding snowball effect of that stress, right? Affecting the behavior, then affecting the intake, production, health, which then can lead to more problems in itself.
So in some ways, stress impact them directly and indirectly. That's fascinating.
For sure, yeah.
Makes it even more important on the farm level. So, and speaking of the farm level, how do we measure this stress? How have you successfully measured the stress, or how have researchers measured at the farm level?
Yeah, and again, a challenge. I think practically, if we're thinking of it from that perspective, and that's probably our biggest challenge, is simply identifying through research first known stressors and being able to walk on farm and identify those stressors. That's probably, from a prevention standpoint, or at least an identification standpoint, our easiest thing to do is just identify those known stressors and take care of those. We can also look to what the animals are doing, obviously, and so measure the behavior of the animals. We have lots of opportunity for that now. Different activity monitors, behavioral monitors, look for changes in activity, lying behavior, rumination, chewing. All those things are good. They could be indicative of stress, but the challenge there is that some of those are non-specific either, right? So there's a whole bunch of different reasons why a cow might stop ruminating or slow down or not be as active. And so we also, in that case, you still have to make an assessment. If you see a change in behavior, whether that's at a cow level or at a group level, you still need to then go investigate and look for the source of that change. We have some opportunities, more physiological measures that I think hold promise, and those are used in research more beyond blood measures of things like cortisol, which I don't see much practicality. They in themselves have a lot of difficulty from an interpretation standpoint. There are other types of measures that we could be looking to and that have been used more in research to date. Things like changes in heart rate variability, changes in temperature, specifically eye temperature is being used, and maximal eye temperature. And so those are things that I think hold more promise when it comes to on-farm kind of diagnostic of stress. Again, I don't think we're quite there yet from an application standpoint, but we're moving in that direction for sure.
Well, you could see somehow the technology that's being adopted being able to fit in there. Heart rate monitors on cows, I guess, just like our sports athletes. Yeah, that's cool. Very interesting to learn. Thank you. So the other point I wanted to raise is the difference between a single stress and multiple stresses, and are they additive? How do we evaluate that at the farm level, or can you expand a bit more on what could be the impact of a single stress versus multiple stresses, and do cows hit tipping points of stresses?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have the exact answer that we would like to hear maybe today, but the challenge has always been, and what we do in science often is we isolate individual factors, right? So we, in an ideal study, we control everything except the one factor that we're really interested in studying, so that we can isolate the effect of that. And we've done that in a lot of circumstances with a lot of these stressors we've talked about, and we do identify some effects. However, often when we go out into the field in commercial systems, we'll see examples of some of those stressors, but not necessarily see negative effects of those. On some operations. But then we'll go to another operation where it's obvious there is some kind of negative effect going on, but as you kind of alluded to, there seems to be maybe some other stressors kind of impacting those animals. And so the question becomes, is there, to your question, an additive effect or a compounding effect of some of these individual things together? And I would say anecdotally, and those that work in the field recognize that that's likely the case, but we just don't have really good data to date to support that, right? There is some challenges in doing that research, and there are, again, efforts being made, and our group's one of those that is hoping to work on some of this coming up in the future, to be able to look at that from a practical standpoint of some of these major stressors we talked about earlier and how they may interact and compound on farm to negatively affect health and productivity of cows.
Not lots to learn yet, and as you said, on some farms it goes great, and other farms even less stress might overwhelm the facilities and the cows. It's interesting. So you mentioned research. What's next in your lab for research in this area or others?
Yeah, and I think, well, just what I was mentioning just now, one of
Yep.
our kind of key things that we hope to work on is this idea of additive nature of stressors, and
Okay.
particularly in and around transition, where we see a lot of these things.
Yep.
I think that's key for us moving forward, and especially when it comes to application of our research for those that are working in the field, being able to walk on a farm and identify that there might be kind of a ranked list, so to speak, of okay, these factors that kind of add up to a tipping point, as you mentioned, and it's when we get to that, then it becomes a real problem, right? And so reducing bottlenecks, so to speak, right, and which may be the most important, or which might be working together. And so we have some work that we've planned to do in that area. We're hoping to do related to that, and long kind of hypothesized is similarly doing that with calves as well, not just transition
Okay.
cows. We see that with, obviously, transition cows seem to be kind of our most vulnerable animals. We see the same thing with calves at various life points, right? Obviously, early in
Okay.
life is a big one, and then weaning time in calves, where often we subject those animals to a whole host of different stressors, right?
Yep.
Reduction in milk, a change in diet, often a change in housing, grouping them, changes in groups, maybe introduce a vaccination or
Okay.
some other stressor at that time. And so again, getting a better handle on how we can maybe minimize some of those impacts, and which of those are most important as well. And then environmental stress on those animals too.
Okay.
There's more and more work on heat stress and climatic variation and how that impacts those animals. And so we're hoping to continue our work in and around that. And I think the third kind of area of stress that I'm quite interested at this time as well is the impact of, again, heat stress and climatic variation on robot milk cows. And
Okay.
we see a lot of adoption of robotic milking in the dairy industry. One of the keystones to robotic milking is voluntary milking. For a cow to voluntarily milk, obviously she needs to have that desire, and anything that's going to have a negative impact on the behavioral pattern of those cows obviously can have a negative impact on her desire to milk voluntarily. And I would suspect that things like heat stress and climatic variation are going to have big impacts on that. And obviously that's also influenced by barn and design and ventilation and interactions there as well. But to date, we really have very little understanding of that in the industry. A lot of our work on heat stress has been focused, and again, in hotter climates and not in those kinds of systems, whereby in, say, the northern U.S., where we see a lot more adoption of robotics, as well as in Canada and northern Europe, we don't necessarily have as much kind of data to support that. And so that's an area that we're hoping to get into in the next while here as well.
Fascinating. Sounds like another episode of Rumination down the way. So thanks for sharing that idea. So that's really cool, how it could impact heat stress being different, in particular in robotics, because of the need for those cows to get up and voluntarily go get milked. Makes a lot of sense. So as we wrap up, take-home points for the audience related to stressors and dairy cows. What message would you like to leave with them?
Well, I think it's, again, we know that stressors can negatively impact cows, and I think our challenges practically is identifying those that probably have the biggest impact on our farms, and whether or not, again, and that's something we still need more work on, but identifying how those might interact and compound. And so we can do that already, I think, to some degree. We'd like data to be able to support some of these things, but in the meantime, recognizing that stressors are there or potentially are there, and looking at whether or not there are opportunities to minimize those on our farms, and find solutions to those is really where we've got to be moving within the industry.
No, makes a lot of sense. And again, thanks for sharing the wealth of your knowledge and areas of research that you're focusing on the near future. So thank you very much for that.
No, thank you for the invite here today, and it's a pleasure as always.
Okay, Trevor, thank you again. And I surely want to thank our audience for listening to us today here at Rumination Podcast. And so that you don't miss this episode or subsequent or past episodes, you can find us at our website at jefo.ca, as well as on Apple and Google Podcasts, as well as Spotify. And this podcast was thankfully brought to you by Jefo Nutrition, precision nutrition for a growing world. Have a great day.